The war ended on a Tuesday in August, 1945. The radio announcement crackled through the humid air of a makeshift military hospital in Manila, where 37 Japanese women sat in silence, their white nurse uniforms stained with blood and mud. They had spent the last 4 years believing they would die for the emperor. Now they were told to surrender to the Americans, to the enemy, to the monsters they had been trained to fear more than death itself. Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka was 28 years old. She had overseen the surgical ward for 3 years, had held the hands of dying soldiers, had written letters to mothers she knew would never read them. When the American jeeps rolled up to the hospital gates, she stood at attention, her spine rigid, her face a mask. Behind her, the younger nurses trembled. One of them, barely 19, whispered a prayer to ancestors she hoped were listening. Another clutched a small photograph of her family in Osaka, the edges worn soft from constant touching. The American soldiers who entered were tall, sunburned, carrying rifles that gleamed in the tropical light. They spoke in a language that sounded harsh and guttural to ears trained in the soft syllables of Japanese. An interpreter, a Japanese-American man with kind eyes and a weary voice, explained that they were now prisoners of war. They would be transported to a holding facility. They would be processed, documented, and held until arrangements could be made for their return home. Home. The word felt foreign now. Tokyo had been bombed into rubble. Osaka was ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were names that now carried a weight too terrible to comprehend. What home was there to return to? As they were loaded onto trucks, Akiko caught the eye of a young American corporal. He looked away quickly. Uncomfortable. She felt a cold satisfaction at that. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them feel the shame of what they had done. She had seen the photographs, heard the reports, the fire bombings, the atomic weapons, the annihilation of entire cities in blinding light. During the truck ride to the camp, the women said little. They sat pressed together on wooden benches, their bodies swaying with each bump in the road. The youngest among them, a girl named Keiko who had volunteered as a nurse's aide at 17, began to cry softly. An older woman, a head nurse with gray streaking her black hair, placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Do not show weakness," she said quietly. "They will use it against us." But it was not weakness that Keiko felt. It was terror. She had heard the stories, the propaganda broadcast on military radio. American soldiers were savages who tortured prisoners. They would rape the women, starve them, force them into labor until they died. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited them in an American prison camp. The camp itself materialized through the jungle like something out of a fever dream. Barbed wire stretched in endless coils around a perimeter of packed dirt and wooden barracks. Guard towers stood at each corner, American flags snapping in the wind. The heat was oppressive, thick enough to choke on. As the trucks stopped and the women were ordered down, the reality settled over them like a burial shroud. This was real. This was happening. They were prisoners now. The processing took hours. They stood in lines, were photographed, fingerprinted, assigned numbers. A female American nurse, blonde and efficient, conducted medical examinations with clinical detachment. She checked for lice, for open wounds, for signs of tuberculosis. She spoke through the interpreter, her voice neither kind nor cruel, simply businesslike. "When did you last eat? Any chronic illnesses? Are you pregnant?" Akiko translated quietly for those who did not speak English. She kept her voice steady, her demeanor calm, but inside, she was calculating, observing, looking for weaknesses in their captors, for opportunities, for anything that might help them survive what was coming. They were issued prison uniforms, rough cotton in dull gray-green. The clothes smelled of soap and something else, something distinctly American that she could not name. As she changed in a communal barracks, surrounded by the other women, she felt the last remnants of her identity as a military officer slip away. They were all the same now. Prisoners, numbers on a roster. Defeated. That first night, they huddled together on thin mattresses laid directly on the wooden floor. The barracks had no walls, only screens to keep out mosquitoes. Through the screens, they could see the lights of the American compound, could hear laughter and music drifting from somewhere distant. Someone was playing a phonograph. The sound of American swing music felt like an insult. "They celebrate while we suffer," one woman muttered bitterly. "They will let us starve," another said. "That is their revenge." Akiko said nothing. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the jungle sounds beyond the wire. Tree frogs, insects, the distant rumble of thunder. She thought about the supplies they had rationed so carefully in the hospital, the way they had stretched a bag of rice to feed 50 men for a week. She thought about the soldiers who had died not from their wounds but from starvation, their bodies consuming themselves in the final days of the war. Would the Americans be crueler? Would they dangle food just out of reach, make them beg, force them to debase themselves for a handful of rice? She did not know. And not knowing was worse than any certain fate. The next morning arrived too soon, announced by a bugle call that shattered the pre-dawn silence. The women rose stiffly, their bodies aching from the hard floors and the weight of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. They lined up for morning count, standing at attention as American guards walked the rows, checking numbers against clipboards. A sergeant, middle-aged with a weathered face, paused in front of Akiko. He studied her for a long moment, then moved on without comment. She exhaled slowly, careful not to show relief. She would give them nothing. No fear, no gratitude, no acknowledgement of their power over her. After count, they were led to a latrine area, then to a washing station where they could rinse their faces and hands in cold water. The facilities were basic but functional. Clean, even. This surprised Akiko. She had expected filth, squalor, deliberate degradation. Instead, there was order, system. The Americans ran their camp with military precision. It made her uneasy. She did not trust this veneer of civilization. At 0800 hours, an announcement came over the loudspeakers. Breakfast would be served in the mess hall. All prisoners were to report in an orderly fashion. As they walked toward the designated building, a low structure with a corrugated metal roof, Akiko felt the tension ripple through the group. This was the moment. This was when they would discover what the Americans truly intended. The mess hall was larger than expected, with long wooden tables arranged in rows. At the far end, steam rose from serving stations where American soldiers in white aprons stood ready with ladles and serving spoons. The smell hit them before they even entered. The rich, unmistakable aroma of cooked meat, pork, and bread. Freshly baked bread. The women stopped in their tracks. Several gasped. One began to shake her head, backing away. "No," she whispered. "It is a trick. They will poison us, or they mock us with food we cannot have," another said. "They will place it before us, and then take it away." Akiko felt her stomach clench with hunger so sharp it was painful. She had not eaten real meat in 2 years. The smell was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She wanted to believe it was real, and she wanted to reject it utterly. An American officer stepped forward, the same Japanese-American interpreter at his side. "Ladies," he said through translation, "you will be fed 3 meals a day while in this facility. The food is prepared according to military standards. There is no poison. There is no trick. You need to eat to regain your strength." Silence met this pronouncement. The women looked at each other, uncertainty written in every line of their faces. "We do not accept charity from our enemies," Akiko heard herself say, her voice carrying across the hall. "We would rather starve with dignity than be fattened like livestock," the interpreter translated. The American officer's expression did not change. "I understand," he said quietly. "But the offer remains. The food is here. Whether you eat it or not is your choice." With that, he turned and left. The guards remained at their posts, but made no move to force anyone toward the serving line. The women stood frozen, caught between pride and hunger, between fear and desperate need. It was Keiko, the youngest, who broke first. Her legs simply gave out, and she sank to the floor, her thin body trembling. "I am so hungry," she sobbed. "I am so hungry, I cannot think. I cannot remember what it feels like not to be hungry." The words cracked something open in the room. Several women moved to help Keiko up, but in doing so, they drifted closer to the serving stations, closer to the smell of pork and bread and something else, something that smelled like hope. One woman, emboldened or simply too weak to resist any longer, stepped forward. She held out her tin plate. An American soldier, young and freckled, ladled a portion of stew onto it. Then he added a thick slice of white bread, steam still rising from its surface. The woman stared at the plate as if it might bite her. Then she carried it to a table and sat down. The others watched, waiting, holding their collective breath. She picked up the bread with trembling fingers, tore off a small piece, brought it to her lips, tasted it, and then she closed her eyes and began to cry. Not from fear, not from shame, but from the simple, overwhelming sensation of flavor, of sweetness, of softness melting on her tongue, of something her body had forgotten existed. "It is real," she whispered. "The food is real." That was the moment the dam broke. Not all at once, not in a rush, but slowly, reluctantly, one by one, the women began to move toward the serving line. They held out their plates. They accepted the portions given. They carried their food to tables and sat down, still uncertain, still afraid, but unable to deny the primal need any longer. Akiko was among the last to move. She told herself she was being practical, strategic. They needed strength to survive. This was merely survival, nothing more. But as she stood before the serving station and watched the ladle full of rich brown stew pour onto her plate, as the American soldier placed not one but two slices of bread beside it, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something small and painful and almost like grief. She sat at a table away from the others. She stared at the food. The chunks of pork glistened with fat. The vegetables, carrots and potatoes, were cooked until tender. The bread was so white it seemed impossible, so soft it compressed under the lightest touch. She picked up a spoon. The metal was cold and smooth. She dipped it into the stew, watching the liquid coat the spoon, watching a piece of pork slide back into the bowl. She brought it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her senses. Salt, richness, warmth. The pork was tender, falling apart at the touch of her tongue. The broth had depth, had been seasoned with herbs she could not name. It was not Japanese food. It was not what she had grown up eating. But it was good. Impossibly good. She took another bite, and another. And then she was eating with a fervor that bordered on desperation, her carefully maintained composure crumbling with each swallow. Around her, the other women were doing the same. Some ate in silence, tears streaming down their faces. Others made small sounds of pleasure and relief. The youngest among them simply wept openly, bread clutched in both hands, unable to stop even as they chewed and swallowed. An older nurse, one who had been particularly vocal about refusing American food, sat with her bowl empty, staring at nothing. "I thought they would let us starve," she said to no one in particular. "I was certain they would let us starve." "Why did they not?" someone asked. No one had an answer. In the days that followed, a routine established itself. Morning count, washing, breakfast, work details, mostly cleaning, and maintenance of their own barracks. Lunch, rest period during the worst heat of the afternoon. Dinner, evening count, lights out. The food continued. 3 meals a day, every day. Pork stew, chicken and rice, beef with gravy, bread with every meal, sometimes with butter, sometimes with jam, fruit, fresh fruit, oranges and bananas that seemed like luxury items from another lifetime. Coffee, bitter and strong, served in metal cups that burned their hands. At first, the women ate in wary silence, still half convinced each meal might be the last. But as the days turned to weeks, something began to shift. Bodies that had been skeletal started to fill out. Faces that had been hollow gained color. Energy returned. And with it, something more dangerous. Hope. Akiko felt it happening to herself and resented it. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope meant you believed there might be something beyond this wire, this camp, this defeat. She tried to hold on to her anger, her pride, her conviction that accepting American food was a form of surrender. But her body betrayed her. She felt stronger. She slept better. When she looked in the small mirror provided in the latrine, she saw a woman who no longer looked like death. It was during the third week that everything changed again. The morning started like any other. Count. Washing. The walk to the mess hall. But when they entered, they found something different waiting. The usual serving stations were there, but beside them stood a folding table covered with a white cloth. On the table sat plates of food arranged with care, and standing beside the table, wearing a clean white apron and a nervous smile, was an American soldier they had not seen before. Through the interpreter, he introduced himself. Sergeant John Carter, head cook for the facility. He had been away on leave, but now he was back, and he had a request. He wanted to serve them breakfast personally. Not as a guard, not as a conqueror, but as one cook to a group of people who deserved a good meal. The women exchanged glances. Was this another form of mockery? Some elaborate humiliation? Carter, seeming to sense their suspicion, spoke again through the interpreter. "I know what you have been told about Americans," he said. "I know you have been taught to fear us, to hate us. Some of that is probably deserved. War makes monsters of us all." He paused, his hands clasped in front of him. "But I also know what hunger feels like. I know what it is to watch people die because there was not enough food. My younger brother died on Okinawa. He was 20 years old." The interpreter's voice wavered slightly on those last words. "I cannot bring him back," Carter continued. "I cannot undo this war, but I can do this one small thing. I can cook good food and serve it with respect. That is all I am offering, a meal made with care." He gestured to the table. Steam rose from bowls of rice porridge, thick and creamy. There were plates of scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow, strips of bacon, crispy at the edges, and in the center, a basket of bread rolls, golden brown and still warm from the oven. "Please," he said. Then, in careful, accented Japanese, he added a phrase that made every woman in the room freeze. "Itadakimasu," the traditional phrase spoken before eating. "I humbly receive." It was what mothers taught children, what families said before meals. A small ritual of gratitude that had nothing to do with war or politics or nations. It was simply human. Akiko felt something crack in her chest. She looked at this American soldier, this enemy, and saw the grief in his eyes. The same grief she carried. The same loss. He had fed them not out of duty or policy, but because he understood what it meant to hunger, what it meant to lose everything. She stepped forward. Her legs felt unsteady. She walked to the table and picked up a plate. Carter served her personally, his hands steady, his movements practiced. Rice, porridge, eggs, 2 strips of bacon, a roll from the basket, which he placed gently on the edge of her plate. "Thank you," she said in English, the first English words she had spoken to an American. His eyes met hers. "You are welcome." She carried her plate to a table and sat down. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of feet as the other women began to follow. The serving line formed, but it was different now. Quieter, more careful. Carter served each woman with the same attention, the same care. He made eye contact. He smiled, not with triumph, but with something that looked almost like sadness. When everyone had been served, he bowed slightly, pressed his palms together, and said again, "Itadakimasu." Then he left the mess hall, leaving them alone with their food. Akiko looked down at her plate. The eggs were still steaming. The bacon smelled of salt and smoke. The rice porridge was smooth and perfect, topped with a pat of butter that was melting into golden pools. She picked up her spoon. The first bite of porridge dissolved on her tongue, creamy and rich and impossibly comforting. It tasted like the rice porridge her grandmother had made when she was a child, sick with fever, wrapped in quilts and told stories about spirits and ancestors. It tasted like home, like safety, like a time before war had consumed everything. She took another bite, and then she felt it, the tightness in her throat, the burning behind her eyes. She tried to swallow it down, to maintain her composure, but it was too much. Too much kindness, too much care, too much humanity from someone she had been taught to see as inhuman. The tears came, silent at first, then with small, choked sounds that she could not control. Around her, she heard the same sounds multiplying. Soft sobs, quiet weeping, the sound of women who had been holding on to rage and fear and pride for so long that when those walls finally crumbled, there was nothing left but raw grief. They cried as they ate. They cried over eggs and bacon and rice, porridge and bread. They cried for their lost homes and lost families and lost certainties. They cried because they had been so certain of cruelty and had been met instead with this simple, devastating kindness. No one spoke. There were no words for what they were feeling. They simply ate and wept. And in that strange communion of shared meals and shared tears, something began to heal. When the meal ended and they filed out of the mess hall, they moved differently. Slower. Softer. The rigid military bearing had softened into something more human, more broken, more real. Outside, the camp looked the same. The barbed wire still gleamed in the tropical Sunday, the guard towers still stood watch. But something fundamental had shifted. The enemy had fed them not just food, but recognition. The acknowledgement that despite everything, they were still human beings, deserving of care. That afternoon during rest period, the women talked. Really talked, for the first time since their capture. They shared stories about the meal, about their reactions, about the soldier who had bowed and said the blessing. Some admitted they felt shame for how readily they had accepted the food. Others said the shame was misplaced, that survival was not surrender. Keiko, the youngest, asked the question they were all thinking. What does it mean? Why do they treat us this way? An older woman, one who had been a teacher before the war, answered slowly. Perhaps it means we were lied to. Perhaps everything we were told about the enemy was meant to keep us fighting even when the cause was lost. Or perhaps, Akiko said quietly, it means that war distorts everything. It makes us believe our enemies are monsters, because it is easier to kill monsters than to kill people. But when the fighting stops, we are left with just people again. Hungry, tired, grieving people. The words hung in the air. No one argued. No one had the energy for ideology anymore. They had been fed. They had been shown unexpected kindness. And now they had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. Over the following days, small changes accumulated. The women began to volunteer for extra work details, not because they were ordered to, but because idleness felt worse than activity. They organized their barracks, created schedules for cleaning and washing. Some who spoke English began teaching the others. Simple phrases. Thank you. Good morning. I do not understand, the American guards noticed. Their posture changed from wary alertness to something almost relaxed. One young private brought a harmonica to his post and played soft melodies in the evening. Another guard, an older man with kind eyes, learned to say good morning in Japanese and used it every day at count. Carter continued to oversee the meals. He began introducing variety, asking through the interpreter if there were foods they particularly missed. When they mentioned rice balls, he researched the recipe and presented them a week later with his American approximation. The rice balls were oddly shaped and the filling was not quite right, but the effort was what mattered. He had tried. He had listened. One evening, Akiko found herself on a work detail that brought her near the kitchen. Carter was there, standing outside with a cigarette, watching the sunset. She paused, uncertain, then approached. He saw her coming and stood straighter, suddenly formal. "Sergeant Carter," she said in careful English. "Ma'am," he replied. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Akiko spoke, the words coming slowly as she searched for the right phrases. "Your brother. On Okinawa. I am sorry." Carter's expression flickered. Pain. Surprise. Something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I am sorry, too, for what happened to your country. We brought much of it on ourselves," Akiko said. "Our leaders chose this war. We followed. We believed we were right." She paused. "I do not know what I believe anymore. That is the first step toward wisdom," Carter said. "Admitting you do not know." Another silence, more comfortable this time. "Why do you feed us so well?" Akiko asked. "You could give us minimum rations." "No one would blame you." Carter took a drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing red in the gathering dark. "Because I have seen what starvation does. I was in Europe before I was transferred here. I saw the camps. I saw what happens when we decide some people deserve to starve." He looked at her directly. "I decided I would never be part of that. Not ever again." Akiko felt tears prick at her eyes again. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she bowed, a small but genuine gesture of respect, and walked away. Behind her, she heard Carter exhale slowly, a sound that might have been relief or sadness or both. That night, lying on her mattress with the jungle sounds filtering through the screens, Akiko made a decision. She would write a letter. She did not know if it would ever be delivered, did not know if anyone she had known in Japan was even still alive, but she needed to tell someone what had happened here, needed to document this strange, unexpected encounter with humanity in the middle of defeat. She requested paper and pencil the next day. The request was granted without question. That evening, by the light of a single bulb hanging from the barrack ceiling, she began to write. "To whomever may read this," she wrote in Japanese characters, "I want to tell you about the day I learned that the enemy was not who I thought they were." She wrote about the surrender, about the fear, about the certainty that they would be brutalized or starved. She wrote about the first meal, about the smell of pork and bread. She wrote about the tears, about the shame and relief and confusion. And she wrote about Sergeant Carter, about a man who had lost his brother but chose to feed his brother's enemies with care and respect. "I do not know what this means for our future," she continued. "I do not know if this kindness is typical or exceptional. But I know that it happened. I know that when I was certain I would be treated as less than human, I was instead reminded of my humanity. That is worth remembering. That is worth recording. So that if anyone ever asks what happened in this place, in these days after the war ended, there will be a true account. Not propaganda, not mythology, just the truth of what one person experienced." She wrote for hours, filling page after page. When she finally stopped, her hand was cramping and the other women were long asleep. She folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside her pillowcase. Someday, somehow, she would make sure these words survived. The weeks continued. The camp settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though nothing about their situation was truly normal. They were still prisoners. They were still defeated. They still did not know when or if they would be allowed to return to Japan, or what Japan they would return to if they did. But they were fed. They were treated with basic human dignity. And slowly, tentatively, they began to believe they might survive this. One morning, about 6 weeks into their captivity, an announcement was made. Representatives from the International Red Cross would be visiting the camp to document conditions and gather names for notification of families. The women were instructed to prepare written statements about their treatment if they wished. Akiko immediately thought of her letter. She retrieved it from its hiding place, added a few more paragraphs detailing recent events, and prepared to submit it to the Red Cross representatives. The day of the visit, the camp was tense with nervous energy. The women dressed carefully in their prison uniforms, making sure they were as clean and presentable as possible. Whatever was documented today would become part of the permanent record. It would be what the world knew about their experience. The Red Cross representatives arrived in a jeep, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing distinctive armbands. They carried clipboards and cameras. They walked through the camp taking notes, photographing the barracks, the mess hall, the washing facilities. They interviewed women at random, asking about food, medical care, treatment by guards. When they reached Akiko, she was ready. She handed them her letter, along with a verbal statement through the interpreter. She spoke carefully, truthfully, about the initial fear and the eventual realization that they were being treated according to Geneva Convention standards. She spoke about the food, about Carter, about the moment everything changed. The woman from the Red Cross listened intently, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. When Akiko finished, the woman asked, "And this letter? What is in it?" "My full account," Akiko replied. "Everything I have witnessed, I want it preserved. I want people to know what truly happened here, not what they imagine happened." The woman took the letter carefully, as if it were something precious. "I will see that it is archived," she said. "Thank you for your testimony." After the Red Cross visit, the atmosphere in the camp shifted again. There was a sense that their situation was temporary, that machinery was in motion to resolve their status. Rumors circulated. Some said they would be repatriated within weeks. Others said it would be months. No one knew for certain. Carter continued to serve meals, but now he sometimes sat with them during the evening meal, at a table slightly apart but not isolated. He told stories about growing up in Ohio, about learning to cook from his mother, about his plans to open a restaurant after his discharge from the military. The women listened, asked questions, shared their own stories in halting English or through interpretation. One evening, Keiko asked him, "Do you hate us for what happened to your brother?" The table fell silent. Even the women at nearby tables stopped talking, waiting for his answer. Carter thought for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I did. For a while, I hated everyone Japanese. I hated the soldiers who killed him, the generals who ordered the attack, the civilians who supported the war. I hated completely and without distinction." He paused. "But hatred is exhausting. It eats you from the inside. And when I actually met Japanese people, when I saw your faces and heard your stories, I realized I had been hating an idea, not real human beings. Real human beings are more complicated than what propaganda tells us." He looked around the table, meeting each woman's eyes. "My brother is still dead. Nothing changes that. But adding more hatred to the world will not bring him back. Maybe feeding people, treating them with dignity, maybe that is a small way to honor his memory. Maybe that is how we start to heal." Several women were crying openly now. Keiko reached across the table and placed her hand on Carter's arm, a brief touch that said more than words could. He nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, and squeezed her hand gently before standing and returning to the kitchen. That moment rippled through the camp. Word spread about what Carter had said, about his admission of grief and his choice to respond with kindness rather than vengeance. The women talked about it in their barracks, during work details, in quiet conversations during rest periods. Something had been named that they had all felt, but not articulated. The possibility of choosing something other than hatred. In late October, official word came. Repatriation ships were being organized. The women in the camp would be among the first groups returned to Japan, processed through Yokohama, and released to whatever families they could locate. They had 2 weeks to prepare. The announcement brought a complex rush of emotions. Relief, anxiety, fear of what they would find when they returned. Japan had been devastated. Cities destroyed. The economy in ruins. What life awaited them? As the departure date approached, the women began to say their goodbyes. To each other, to the guards they had grown familiar with, to the camp that had been their home in this strange liminal period between war and peace. On their last evening, Carter prepared a special meal. Nothing elaborate, just the same pork, stew, and bread that had been the first real meal they had eaten as prisoners. But he served it personally, as he had that first time, with the same care and attention. And when everyone was seated, he stood at the front of the mess hall and spoke. "Ladies," he said through the interpreter, "tomorrow you go home. I cannot imagine what awaits you there, but I hope you find peace. I hope you find family. I hope you find a way to rebuild your lives." He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "You have taught me something important in these weeks. You have taught me that our enemies are only enemies because of circumstances, because of decisions made by leaders far away. If we had met in different times, in different places, we might have been friends. We might have shared meals and stories and laughter." He raised his cup. "So tonight, I offer you this meal not as a jailer to prisoners, but as one human being to others. May you travel safely, may you find what you are looking for, and may you remember that even in the darkest times, there can be kindness." The women raised their cups in response. And then, together, Carter and all 37 women said the blessing. Itadakimasu. They ate slowly that night, savoring each bite, knowing it was the last time they would share this ritual. Some cried, some laughed, remembering funny moments from their time in the camp. Some sat in reflective silence, lost in thoughts about the past and the uncertain future. When the meal ended, Akiko approached Carter one last time. She handed him a small piece of paper, folded carefully. "Open it after we leave," she said. He accepted it with a nod, tucking it into his shirt pocket. They bowed to each other, a formal gesture that somehow felt intimate. Then Akiko turned and walked back to her barracks for the last time. The next morning, the women boarded trucks in the pre-dawn darkness. The camp that had been their prison and their refuge fell away behind them as they drove toward the port. None of them looked back. The future was ahead now, whatever it held. Carter stood at the gate, watching until the last truck disappeared from view. Then he returned to his quarters and opened the folded paper Akiko had given him. It was a drawing, done in pencil with surprising skill. It showed a table with a basket of bread, steam rising from bowls, and in the background, the suggestion of people gathered together. At the bottom, written in careful English, were the words, "Thank you for reminding us we are human." He stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, tears running unchecked down his face. 30 years later, in the spring of 1975, a man in his early 70s walked through the crowded streets of Tokyo. John Carter, retired now, living in Florida with his wife and grandchildren, had returned to Japan for the first time since the war. He was attending a peace memorial event, invited as a veteran who had worked in POW rehabilitation. During the reception, a woman approached him. She was elderly, her hair completely gray, her face lined with decades of life, but her eyes were sharp and kind. She introduced herself in English, her accent still present, but her vocabulary confident. "Sergeant Carter," she said, "you do not remember me, but I remember you." He studied her face, searching his memory, and then recognition dawned. "Lieutenant Tanaka?" She smiled. "Just Akiko now. I am no one's lieutenant anymore." They moved to a quieter corner, away from the crowd. For a while, they simply looked at each other, seeing the young people they had been inside these aged bodies. "I received your letter," Carter said, "through the Red Cross. Years later, but I received it. I have kept it, all this time." Akiko's eyes widened. "You have it still? In a safety deposit box in my bank. It is precious to me. It helped me understand what you all experienced, what it meant." "And your restaurant?" Akiko asked. "Did you open it?" "I did. Small place. Nothing fancy. But honest food, made with care. I named it Grace, because I learned about grace in that camp. About giving people what they do not deserve but desperately need." Akiko reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I brought you something." Carter unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a loaf of bread, homemade, the crust golden brown and perfect. The smell of it brought back memories so powerful, he felt dizzy. "I learned to bake," Akiko said. "After I came home, after I rebuilt my life, I remembered that bread in the camp, how it tasted like hope. I wanted to learn how to make hope for other people. Carter could not speak. He held the bread like it was something sacred. They sat together on a bench outside the memorial hall, this old American veteran and this old Japanese nurse, and they broke bread together. No ceremony, no speeches, just two people who had once been enemies, sharing a simple meal in the spring sunshine. Around them, the city hummed with life. Tokyo had risen from its ashes, had rebuilt itself into a gleaming metropolis of steel and glass and endless energy. The war was history now, studied in textbooks, remembered in monuments. But for these two people sitting on a bench with breadcrumbs on their laps, it was something more immediate. It was the defining event of their youth. The crucible that had shaped everything that came after. "Tell me," Carter said finally, "what happened when you returned? I have always wondered." Akiko gazed out at the street, her expression distant. "It was worse than I imagined. My family's home in Osaka was gone. Completely. Not even rubble remained. Just a flat space where a house had been. My parents had died in the firebombing. My younger sister survived but was living in a refugee camp." She paused, her voice steady despite the weight of the memories. "I found her eventually. We rebuilt together. It took years, many years. And the other women? From the camp? I stayed in touch with a few. Keiko, the youngest, she married an American soldier. Lives in California now. Has 4 children. She writes to me sometimes. Others I lost track of. Some did not survive the return. Japan was very hard in those first years after the war." Akiko looked at him. "But I survived. And when things were at their darkest, when I wanted to give up, I would remember that meal. That first meal with the pork and the bread. I would remember that even enemies could show mercy. It gave me hope that the world could be rebuilt, that people could be better than their worst moments." Carter nodded slowly. "I struggled too, after the war. Nightmares, guilt, survivor's guilt they call it now. Why did I live when my brother died? Why did I get to come home when so many did not?" He smiled sadly. "But cooking helped. Feeding people helped. Every time I put a good meal in front of someone, I felt like I was doing something right, something that mattered." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching people pass by. Young couples holding hands. Children running ahead of tired parents. Businessmen in suits, rushing to appointments. All of them living lives made possible by the peace that had been so hard won. "Do you think we learned anything?" Akiko asked suddenly. "From all that suffering? Or do we just repeat the same mistakes?" Carter considered the question carefully. "I think some of us learned. The ones who saw up close what war does, who felt it in our bodies and our hearts. We learned. But that knowledge dies with us. The next generation, they do not feel it the same way. They know it intellectually, but not viscerally, not in the way that changes you." "Then what is the point?" Akiko asked, not bitterly, but with genuine curiosity. "What is the point of our remembering if the knowledge cannot be passed on? Maybe the point is not in the grand scale," Carter said. "Maybe it is in the small moments, the individual choices. I chose to feed you with dignity instead of contempt. You chose to accept that gesture instead of clinging to hatred. Those were small choices, but they mattered. They changed us. And maybe if enough people make small choices toward kindness instead of cruelty, it adds up to something larger." Akiko smiled. "You have become a philosopher in your old age. I have had a lot of time to think about it all," Carter admitted. "Too much time. Maybe. But I needed to make sense of it, needed to understand why I survived, what I was supposed to do with the years I was given. And have you found the answer?" "I think so. I think we survive, so we can tell the story. So we can say to the next generation, this is what war looks like, up close. This is what hatred does, but this is also what mercy looks like. What forgiveness makes possible. Both things are true. The horror and the hope." Akiko reached over and took his hand, her grip still surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being part of my story, for being the person who showed me that enemies could be human. Thank you for letting me, Carter replied, his voice thick with emotion, for giving me the chance to be better than my worst self. They sat there holding hands, two old people with their private memories and their shared history, until the sun began to sink toward the horizon and the shadows grew long. Finally, reluctantly, they stood up. They exchanged addresses, promised to write. They embraced, briefly but genuinely, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 30 years earlier. As Carter watched Akiko walk away into the Tokyo evening, disappearing into the crowd, he felt a sense of completion. A circle, closing. He had carried guilt and grief for so long, had wondered if his small acts of kindness in that camp had meant anything at all. Now he knew. They had meant everything. They had helped one person survive, helped her maintain her humanity through impossible circumstances. And that was enough. That was more than enough. He looked down at the remaining piece of bread in his hand. It was a simple thing, flour and water and yeast and salt, but it was also a symbol of something larger. Connection, compassion, the basic human instinct to feed and be fed, to care and be cared for. He took a bite, tasting the subtle sweetness, the perfect texture. Akiko had learned well. She had taken that moment of hope from so long ago and transformed it into skill, into purpose, into something she could offer back to the world. In the camp, all those years ago, he had said that food could speak when words failed. He had been right. This bread spoke volumes. It said, I remember. I forgave. I grew. I became something more than what the war tried to make me. Carter walked back toward his hotel, the Tokyo streets alive with neon and noise and the relentless energy of a nation that had rebuilt itself from devastation. He thought about his restaurant back in Florida, about the meals he would cook when he returned. He thought about his grandchildren, who knew about the war only from history books and their grandfather's occasional stories. Maybe he would tell them about Akiko, about the camp, about the moment he realized that the women he was feeding were not the enemy, just people caught in circumstances beyond their control. Maybe that story would plant a seed. Maybe it would help them understand that hate is a choice. But so is compassion. That night, in his hotel room, Carter wrote in the journal he had kept since the war. He described the reunion, the conversation, the bread. And then he wrote something he had been carrying for decades but had never quite articulated. I used to think my brother died for nothing, that his sacrifice was wasted in a war that should never have been fought. But today I realized that his death, terrible as it was, pushed me toward a choice. I could let it harden me into someone bitter and cruel, or I could let it open me to the pain others felt, to the universal nature of loss. I chose the latter, and because of that choice, I was able to offer a small mercy to people who desperately needed it. My brother's death still grieves me, but maybe, in some small way, something good came from that grief. Maybe that is the only redemption we get in this life. The chance to transform our pain into something that helps others bear theirs. He closed the journal and turned off the light. Through the window, Tokyo glowed against the night sky, a testament to resilience and renewal. He fell asleep thinking about bread, about the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into sustenance, about how the act of feeding someone is one of the most fundamental expressions of love. 6 months later, Akiko received a letter from Florida. Inside was a recipe card in Carter's careful handwriting, his mother's recipe for dinner rolls, the ones he had served in the camp all those years ago. At the bottom, he had written, "For when you want to make hope for someone." Akiko pinned the recipe card to the wall of her small kitchen. And the next time a neighbor was struggling, the next time a friend faced a crisis, she baked those rolls. She brought them over still warm, the way Carter had served them. She offered them without expectation, without needing thanks or recognition. Just a simple gift. Bread and mercy, intertwined. Over the years, others asked her for the recipe. She shared it freely, along with the story of where it came from. And so the recipe spread, hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, carrying with it the memory of a moment when kindness broke through the barriers of war and nationality and hatred. Those who baked the rolls did not know the full story, but they felt something when they pulled the golden loaves from their ovens, when they broke bread with their families or shared it with strangers. They felt the echo of something important, something about our capacity to choose compassion even when we have every excuse not to. Something about how small gestures accumulate into larger truths. The recipe survived both Akiko and Carter. It was printed in community cookbooks, shared on recipe cards at church potlucks, posted on kitchen bulletin boards, and every time someone made those rolls and served them with care, they were participating in a legacy they did not even know existed. A legacy that said, "Feed people with dignity. Remember that enemies are just people we have not yet understood. And never underestimate the power of a simple meal to change hearts." In a small museum in Yokohama, there is an exhibit about prisoner of war camps in the Pacific. Among the photographs and documents, there is a letter written in Japanese, carefully preserved behind glass. It is Akiko's letter, the one she wrote in the camp and submitted to the Red Cross. Next to it is a translation, so visitors can read her account of fear transformed into gratitude, of hate transformed into hope. And beside the letter is a photograph taken in 1975. Two elderly people sitting on a bench, bread between them, smiling at the camera with the kind of warmth that comes only from shared experience and hard-won understanding. The placard beside the display reads, "Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka and Sergeant John Carter, former nurse and former cook, former enemies and lifelong friends. Their story reminds us that even in war, humanity can prevail. That a simple meal, offered with respect and received with openness, can begin the difficult work of healing." School children pass the display on field trips. They read the letter. They look at the photograph. Most of them move on quickly, more interested in the dramatic exhibits about battles and generals. But sometimes, one child pauses. One child reads the whole letter, studies the photograph, and asks their teacher, "Did this really happen? Did people really change their minds like that?" And the teacher, if they are wise, answers, "Yes, it really happened. Not everywhere, not all the time, but it happened. And it can happen again, if we choose it. That is the point. We get to choose. Every day, we get to choose between hardening our hearts and opening them, between seeing enemies and seeing people, between perpetuating cycles of hatred and breaking them." The child nods, not fully understanding yet, but sensing the importance. They will grow up. They will face their own conflicts, their own moments of choosing between compassion and cruelty, and perhaps, in some distant moment of crisis, they will remember a photograph of two old people sharing bread. They will remember that transformation is possible, that the enemy can become a friend, that a meal can become a bridge. This is how memory works, not in grand monuments or official histories, but in small moments of recognition passed from one generation to the next, in stories told and recipes shared and choices made in the privacy of our own hearts. John Carter died in 1983, surrounded by family, his life full of years and meaning. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his successful restaurant, his devotion to his family. It did not mention the camp in the Philippines or the Japanese women he fed with such care. Those details were too small for an obituary, too personal for public record. But at his funeral, a letter arrived from Japan. It was from Akiko, unable to travel at her age but wanting to say goodbye to her friend. The letter was read aloud at the service. She wrote about the moment he bowed and said "Itadakimasu," about how that single gesture of respect had cracked open a door she thought was sealed forever. She wrote that he had saved her life, not by keeping her alive physically, but by keeping her human, by refusing to let war turn her into something less than herself. "He showed me," she wrote, "that we are not defined by our worst moments or by the wars we fight. We are defined by how we treat each other when the fighting stops, by whether we choose revenge or reconciliation, hatred or hope." John Carter chose hope. He chose it every day in that camp, with every meal he prepared, with every gesture of respect and dignity. And because he chose it, I learned to choose it too. That is his legacy. That is what he leaves behind. There was not a dry eye in the church. Akiko herself passed away 7 years later, in 1990. Her daughter, going through her mother's belongings, found a metal box tucked in the back of a closet. Inside were letters, photographs, and a carefully preserved piece of paper the drawing Akiko had given Carter, which his widow had sent back to her after his death. On the back, in Carter's handwriting, were the words, "The most important meal I ever served." The daughter sat on the floor of her mother's empty apartment, surrounded by the detritus of a long life, and wept. Not from sadness alone, but from the recognition of something profound. Her mother had carried this memory for 50 years, had built her life around the lesson learned in that moment, and now it was her responsibility to carry it forward. She donated the box to the museum, where it joined the growing collection of personal stories from the war. The curator who accepted it said, "These stories matter. They matter because they show us that war is not just about politics and strategy and grand historical forces. It is about people. Individual people making individual choices, and those choices ripple out in ways we cannot always predict." The story of the meal, of the pork and bread and tears, became part of the permanent collection. It was included in documentaries, referenced in books, taught in schools, not because it was dramatic or heroic, but because it was true, because it captured something essential about the human capacity for change. And in kitchens around the world, people still make those dinner rolls. Most of them do not know where the recipe came from, but some do. Some bake the rolls and tell their children, "This is more than food. This is a lesson. This is a reminder. This is hope made tangible, mercy made edible, forgiveness made real." The children eat the rolls and say they are delicious. They do not understand the significance yet, but the taste is planted in their memory, waiting for the moment when they will need to remember that enemies can break bread together, that hatred can transform into understanding, that a simple meal can change everything. This is how we survive the worst we do to each other. Not by forgetting, but by remembering. Not the atrocities alone, but also the moments of grace that emerged from the darkness. The small acts of defiance against cruelty. The choices to be kind when kindness seemed impossible. A meal of pork and bread, served to women who expected death and received dignity instead. A gesture so small it barely registered in the grand sweep of history, yet so powerful it echoed across decades, across oceans, across the vast gulf between enemy and friend. We thought they would starve us. The women had whispered to each other in the darkness of that first night, but they fed us instead. And in feeding us, they reminded us of something we had almost forgotten, that we were human beings, worthy of care, capable of growth, deserving of a second chance. That is what the meal meant. That is what it still means. That is why the story refuses to die, passed from one generation to the next like a treasured recipe or a beloved photograph, because we need these stories. We need to know that transformation is possible, that bridges can be built even over the widest chasms, that bread and mercy, offered together, can heal wounds we thought were permanent. The war ended with fire and devastation and unimaginable loss, but it also ended with this: a room full of hungry women, a pot of stew, a basket of bread, and a man who chose to serve with respect instead of contempt. In the end, that is what we remember. Not because it erases the horror, but because it proves that even in the midst of horror, humanity survives. Battered, exhausted, barely recognizable, but alive. Still capable of reaching across divides. Still able to feed and be fed, to care and be cared for, to forgive and be forgiven. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is what remains when everything else has turned to dust. A meal, a gesture, a choice, and the quiet, persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, we can be better than our worst selves. That maybe we can learn, slowly and painfully, to see each other not as enemies but as fellow travelers through this difficult world. All of us hungry, all of us searching, all of us deserving of something as simple and profound as bread broken and shared in the spirit of peace.